Today's webinar is entitled, How to Live a Happy and Healthy Gluten-Free Lifestyle. Our presenter today is Calvin Eaton, class of '07. He graduated with a degree in Hotel and Tourism Management, and in '09 he graduated with a degree in Health Systems Administration. Calvin's goal has always been to make gluten-free living accessible to everyone. His blog features foolproof recipes and meal plans, ensuring that everyone can and will eat wonderful gluten-free meals and never tell the difference. Mr. Eaton intends to continue to raise awareness for gluten intolerance by offering a variety of workshops, classes, networking events, and private lessons, all tailored to those who are living gluten-free. Calvin is the CEO and creative director of the gluten-free chef blog, Omnimedia, LLC, a multifaceted media platform with a reach of over 15,000 daily impressions. On May 1st, he added a newly renovated community event and education center coined 540 West Main in the National Register Historic Susan B. Anthony District of Rochester. Learn more by visiting www.540westmain.org. Now we'll hear from Calvin. Take it away, Calvin.
Okay, so my name again is echoing Katie, our host here. I'm Calvin Eaton, and I am presenting how to live a happy and healthy gluten-free lifestyle. I'd like to just kind of get us started with our objectives so that we essentially understand and know the purpose and objectives of our session for this afternoon. By the end of the webinar, it's the hope that you'll be able to understand what celiac disease is, articulate what the term gluten-free means, build a basic understanding of the types of foods that are gluten-free, and then also know how to incorporate gluten-free foods into your everyday lifestyle. And as Katie mentioned in her wonderful introduction, feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar if you have a question that comes up as we go throughout the presentation, or that can happen before the end of the presentation. Before we get started with the actual meat and potatoes of our show today, the questions that I kind of want everyone to anchor them in their mind kind of for the discussion, we'll kind of go through 4 questions and then we will revisit these at the end. So the first, is it expensive to eat gluten-free? What foods are gluten-free? Where can I go online to learn more about gluten-free eating? And what are some of the best gluten-free brands? So these are essentially some of the most basic questions or most common questions that I get as an educator and person living gluten-free. And so these questions and many more will be answered throughout the presentation this afternoon. So just kind of to introduce myself to all of you, my name is Calvin Eaton, and I'm 31 years old, and I live here in Rochester, New York. And I am kind of multifaceted here as an educator, writer, blogger, and one kind of just like a random thing about myself is that I really love and enjoy reading. You can find more information about me at theglutenfreechefblog.com, and you can also learn more about gluten-free living and eating through my podcast series, which is currently kind of on a break now, but we have 2 seasons that are up. So if you visit the website SoundCloud and type in Ask the Gluten-Free Chef podcast, you can kind of learn more about the podcast. And really the purpose of the podcast is to answer many of the most common questions that people all over the world have submitted to me over the years that I've been gluten-free. You can also ask me a question kind of off record or later at asktheglutenfreechef@gmail.com. That is kind of my catch-all email for everything that I do here. Just to kind of get started, it's always, when people learning that someone has celiac disease, there's always usually a journey that goes with that. And so I just want to kind of give everyone just the synopsis, if you will, of my story of celiac disease. I was formally diagnosed in the spring of 2011, but I've been pretty much gluten-free since 2008. It was around that time that I was just really ill, symptoms, gastrointestinal discomfort, bloating, et cetera, were happening, and I just really was fatigued and really felt unwell And then it was really around that time that I really started to be more conscious as a young adult about my health and kind of what I was eating and et cetera. So around that time, in addition to trying to, I guess, find an answer or cure to some of these issues, I actually started a weight loss journey because I was, at that time, about, close to 360 pounds. And so, obviously, when you're going to the doctor kind of presenting these types of symptoms, weight is always an issue, was an issue. And so that was really like, maybe if you lose weight, you will start to feel better. Around that time, I was about 24, and as we kind of progressed through 2009, 2010, I was first diagnosed with the chronic illness fibromyalgia, which is an illness or a disease of the central nervous system and kind of how my brain processes pain. And so I started a self-induced weight elimination diet in 08, 09, and again, kind of going back into the fact that I was really ill. I was diagnosed with mono, and at one point in the winter of 2010, I was bedbound for about a month. I was living out in Churchville, New York at the time, and kind of presenting these symptoms over these years. I was, I would go through periods of a weight elimination, feel somewhat better, and then introduce bread and pasta back into my diet. And really in these early stages, I really didn't know, I had no idea or had never even heard about celiac disease, but I just knew that during the times that I would stop eating wheat or bread or pasta, I felt better. And so after doing that a couple different times and taking, notes and my food diary back to my doctors, they never brought up celiac disease, but I just knew that when I didn't eat bread, I felt better. So I just pretty much stopped eating bread and pasta that, was wheat-based around that time. So really, as we kind of fast forward into now, I've been, again, like I said, gluten-free since about 2008. And so really, my mantra is be gluten-free. And when I say that, it really means that, pretty much everyone, for the most part, usually if you're eating a diet that's really whole foods-based, foods that, come straight from the ground, and you're eating them in that state, things that you can grow in a garden, lean meat, etc., you're pretty much, if you stick to that type of a diet in general, you're already eating gluten-free, just because most fruits and vegetables, fresh fruits and vegetables, are just naturally gluten-free. And so when you start talking about, gluten-free eating and paleo eating, you really start to get into issue when you start to introduce processed foods into your diet. And, in our culture, in American society, convenience foods, fast foods are, prevalent. And so most of these things, when you talk about like snack cakes, et cetera, things that you buy at fast food restaurants, they have a wheat-based. Most breads have a wheat-based. And so for persons with celiac disease like myself, it's the gluten in wheat, rye, and barley that is an issue. And so that pretty much takes us into our next informational slide, really getting into the basics of it. What is celiac disease? So celiac disease, and I'll pretty much read this verbatim because I think that it's a pretty succinct and clear and simple definition of celiac disease. It's an autoimmune disorder that can occur in genetically predisposed people where the ingestion of gluten leads to damage of the small intestine. When foods containing gluten are ingested, an autoimmune-mediated toxic reaction is created that causes damage to the small intestine. So when wheat or gluten is introduced into the body sees it as some type of a foreign substance that it needs to attack. So in addition to attacking the particles or whatever of gluten in your body, it's also attacking the healthy cells. And that's why it's an autoimmune illness, because your healthy cells are being attacked as well. And this damage causes damage to the way that food is absorbed in the small intestine. And so really right now, where science is and where the medical community is on finding some type of a remedy for celiac disease and this autoimmune illness, the only foolproof prescription for it is to maintain and adhere to a strict gluten-free diet. And so for anyone who's like interested more into the science of celiac disease and gluten, you can learn more by clicking the link that's in the chat box over, I believe it should be to the right of your screen there. Celiac disease is not a food allergy, so, you know, persons who have a wheat allergy or, you know, something like that, celiac disease is very different from what's considered medically or the scientific definition of a food allergy. It's estimated that it affects in about 1 in 100 people worldwide. 2.5 million Americans are undiagnosed and are at risk for long-term health complications because of having undiagnosed celiac disease for a long time. Over time, as you can imagine, the damage that's caused by nutrients not being absorbed properly into your body leads to many complications, and many of these that are listed here are the things that I was dealing with when I was just like, you know, kind of, you know, simply put, ill. So, fatigue, irritable bowel syndrome, skin rashes, constipation, extreme weight loss, and many other things over time. Ingesting even trace amounts of gluten kind of consistently can really, it leads to other issues, and really those other ailments that kind of are a result of the damage that celiac disease is doing. You can, you know, potentially die because of another illness. So it's not so much that celiac disease will kill me, but really what's caused because of the issues that happen when celiac disease has gone untreated for many lengths of time. And just kind of an aside, this is not on the informational slide in front of you. For instance, many children who are diagnosed at like, you know, 3 or 4 years old, they're diagnosed by their pediatrician because usually parents start to notice that the child is not growing, you know, appropriately. And so usually when children are diagnosed, they've been sent to their pediatrician because there is some malnourishment issues that are happening. Parents are noticing that their child they're not growing, like getting taller, you know, their limbs are not developing properly. And so it's been found that celiac disease can stunt growth in young children. So there's many different ailments that kind of are a direct result of celiac disease being left untreated, and as a result of that, it's really serious. And so really the objective and purpose of this information is to really help everyone to understand that, you know, even though gluten-free is really trendy right now, and there is a lot of like media jokes and, you know, laughs about it, it's really not a lasting matter for those of us who do deal with it. And so it's a real, you know, illness. It's really what we want to articulate to all of you. So then kind of talking about celiac disease and wheat and gluten, the question then comes up, so what exactly is gluten? So simply put, gluten is the protein found in grains such as wheat, barley, rye, and spelt. And really at the molecular level, the microscopic level, if you take like one singular grain of wheat, put it under a microscope, you'll kind of see, kind of going to the science of the parts of a seed, kind of on the outside layer, the exosperm of a seed or grain, you see that there's a coating around it of protein, and that protein is called gluten in grains of wheat, barley, rye, and spelt. And it's the gluten that gives bread the elasticity that it has. You know, you think about when you make pie crust or dough of some sort, and you're able to really bend it and pull it and stretch it. It's the gluten that gives it that property. And so grains such as rice, corn, oats, and buckwheat are naturally gluten-free grains. And so it's really when you start talking about things that are baked, things that use flour as a base of some sort, is where you start to get into the need to have grains or dry mixes or dry ingredients that are not wheat, barley, rye, or spelt. And so when you see things such as rice flour, corn flour, corn starch, you know, you can really dry anything out like a bean. You can make black bean flour, for instance, or you can roast chickpeas and make chickpea flour if you mill the dried chickpeas down. So you have to start thinking about using alternative flours, you know, or dry ingredients that are not wheat, barley, rye, or spelt. Most processed foods, as we've mentioned, contain some trace amount of wheat, and there can be hidden traces of wheat in everything from salad dressing to ice cream, because again, it goes back to that processed food. Wheat is used in a lot of things that you wouldn't even naturally think of as binders. When you start getting into food science, etc., you start to really learn why it's so important to read labels, and that's why usually most people with celiac disease are very learned, and you become very learned on reading labels, asking questions about ingredients, where things were sourced, etc. So foods that are naturally gluten-free then, as I've mentioned, are whole fruits and veggies, milk and eggs, seeds and nuts, beans and legumes, black beans, pinto beans, those types of things, corn, rice, tapioca. There's a grass called sorghum that I use a lot in baking. Coconut, so you can buy coconut flour, almond flour, or whole coconuts or whole almonds, pistachios, those types of foods are gluten-free, including any starch or flour that's made from these ingredients being dried and then milled. And again, for kind of ancillary information, you can look in the link in the chat bar and go to the SoundCloud page. On my podcast, I have a podcast specifically dedicated to what foods are gluten-free in the Ask the Gluten-Free Chef podcast series. Again, kind of going back to reading labels carefully, being mindful of processing, and really, even though something might be naturally gluten-free, like for instance, if someone prepares a salad for you or for someone who has celiac disease, obviously the lettuce and tomatoes or chickpeas or whatever, onions that go into a salad are naturally gluten-free. But if that salad is prepared using a bowl or using some type of a cooking surface or pan or skillet that used or had breadcrumbs or something that was wheat-based or gluten containing in it, now you enter into the realm of cross-contamination. So again, for those of us who have celiac disease, going into restaurants becomes an issue, because at least a lot of places in our area are not dedicated to only preparing gluten-free ingredients. So then you start thinking about cross-contamination in surfaces. Flour particles can remain in the air for up to 1 week, so you can ingest gluten through breathing. And then there's also things to think about, like body butters and lotions, shampoo. All the things that you put on your skin or on your body get into your body through your skin. So you also have to look at non-food items like shampoos, because those oftentimes contain traces of wheat or gluten as well. When you're looking at ingredient labels and you start looking at things such as, maltodextrin or maltodextrin modified starches, natural flavorings, those are the process kind of buzzwords or buzz terms on an ingredient label that for me, or someone who has celiac disease, would kind of you'd question, okay, natural flavoring, artificial flavoring, what exactly is that natural flavoring derived from? More times than not, it's derived from corn or wheat, usually, in our food system. And there's another link here to kind of talk about, that talks more specifically and in more detail about hidden sources of gluten here at udisglutenfree.com. And so, again, there's a link for that in the sidebar or the chat bar here. So we're about halfway through the presentation, and those of you who are listening, if you have any questions, please do feel free to submit those in your chat box, and we can talk about hidden sources of gluten and some of the things that we've discussed so far. So moving right along here, a lot of things that I've heard as an educator and as a person who lives with celiac disease is that in our media and in our food world, and when you start thinking about some of the brands now, General Mills, et cetera, who are adopting gluten-free products, I've noticed that what's happening is that individuals or organizations are using gluten-free as a catchword or as a substitute for healthy. And so I want to be clear that eating gluten-free or gluten-free foods, especially processed foods, are not necessarily any healthier than just regular wheat-based processed foods. You really need to be looking at your ingredients and the nutritional content, the fat content, the protein content, the fiber content of items, whether something is gluten-free or not. Food labeled gluten-free are not necessarily healthier or better for you than any other food. And again, I'm not a nutritionist or, someone who deals with nutrition, but, someone who has gone from a place of obesity and who really is careful and watching, what I eat in my diet and my nutrients. When you stick to that 80-20 rule of eating 80% whole, real food and keeping your fats and sugars and those types of things to 20% of your general diet, that's where you really want to kind of stick to. So it's not so much about something being gluten-free that makes it healthier, but really looking at, the content of it in general. How much fiber does it have? How much protein does it have? Is it something that I can grow in a garden? Is it a fruit or vegetable? As a rule, containing foods that are free from added salt, added preservative, added sugar, and empty calories are ways that you can speak to your diet and helping you maybe lose weight, and then also increasing your activity level. Of course, that rule stays the same whether you need to eat a gluten-free diet or not. And kind of going along with that as well, many individuals adopt a gluten-free diet for various reasons. So individuals who are eating or living gluten-free may not necessarily have celiac disease per se. They might have a gluten sensitivity or a gluten intolerance, which those two things, intolerance and a gluten sensitivity, are also real, tangible, medically recognized conditions as well that are separate and different from celiac disease. But sometimes, there are other reasons why people eat gluten-free, and, what I always tell people is that, every person should make the personal decision of what they feel is best for them to consume or eat for themselves and their family. And regardless of what any doctor or medical professional tells you, if you feel that after eating something or not eating something, just generally you feel better when you don't eat it, then go with that. You live in your body 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No one else does, and so really you're the best person to speak to what is best for you to consume or not. And, most of us in America are really blessed to be able to have choices in what we eat or what we don't eat. And so really, be, an independent thinker and someone, eat whatever you eat because, for your own self, whether, you have religious reasons for excluding certain things, whether you might have medical reasons or whatever. Don't get so caught up into, just kind of like the media's definition of what's healthier or not, but really, get the knowledge, take the time to understand, and then, make an informed choice on what you want to eat or not eat for yourself. You can also visit the Department of Agriculture's Choose My Plate website for more recommendations on what is a healthy, just daily diet. And, remember, these are recommendations, and again, it's up for each individual person and family to decide what foods are best for you to consume or for you not to consume. And I am just going to flip through a few pages here. And this word diet, I kind of want to speak on it a little bit. When I'm talking about diet in this instance or in this context, I'm not speaking of diet in the sense of trying to restrict caloric intake in order to lose weight. I'm speaking of diet in the context of a way or a general way someone eats day-to-day kind of in general. So diet, therefore gluten-free diet means that, you consume gluten-free foods in your daily life, or when you have a whole foods diet, generally speaking, you try to more often than not are eating foods that are whole, real food and not something that comes from a box or a container. Another very common question that I get as someone who has lost weight, you know, a significant amount of weight, or someone who is really kind of thinking about what I'm ingesting regularly or on a daily basis, does a gluten-free diet aid in weight loss? You know, this again kind of speaks to some of the rhetoric that is happening in the media with some of these, you know, celebrity fitness gurus, etc. You know, scientifically or medically speaking, a gluten-free diet is not a weight loss diet in the sense of restricting foods or food groups in an effort to reduce calories or lose weight. A gluten-free diet is a way of eating that excludes foods made with wheat, durum, barley, rye, and other grains that contain gluten, okay? So with that being said, you know, I sometimes hear people saying, you know, oh, for instance, I'm a baker as well. I've owned a retail bakery, and I bake gluten-free products, cakes, cookies, etc., which, just generally speaking, you know, if you're using like butter, eggs, sugar, you know, are not healthy. The same way that you can make cookies or a cake that uses less sugar or uses less butter or uses less oil, you can do the same thing with gluten-free baking, and you can also bake gluten-free that contains a lot of sugar or contains a lot of fat, etc. So, you know, when you talk about the gluten-free diet or gluten-free products, you really don't want to get caught up into thinking that gluten-free means that something is healthier. Many of the gluten-free convenience products, you know, potato chips, crackers, are high in salt, you know, are high in empty calories, and you have to be mindful of not consuming too many processed gluten-free foods, just the same as foods that contain gluten might be full of, you know, salt and sugar, preservatives, etc. So gluten-free diet does not necessarily aid in weight loss. When you're talking about weight loss, you really want to consult with a physician. You want to consult with a nutritionist. You want to stick to whole, real foods that are not packaged, that have not been processed heavily. You want to increase your activity level, exercise more. You want to do that in a safe way, in a healthy way. And so really, when you start talking about excluding foods from your diet, you really want to, for one, do your own research as a person, as a consumer. You want to definitely consult with a nutritionist or with a healthcare professional. If you want to start thinking about excluding whole food groups or food groups from your diet just kind of every day. I know there's been some rhetoric that I've heard or been read in the media as well that, you know, it's unhealthy to eat a gluten-free diet, and, you know, again, you don't want to go that route as well. You really want to be balanced in your thinking and understanding. Again, looking at labels, looking at ingredients, looking at the fiber content of items, the protein content, etc., really can help you make a better choice as opposed to just saying gluten-free eating is healthier or gluten-free eating is not healthy. You know, you want to look at the whole of the picture and not just a part of it. You know, a tip that I give, if you're someone who has been diagnosed with celiac disease and you kind of want some guidelines or some advice on where to start, you definitely want to be adventurous and open-minded. You know, a celiac diagnosis usually means that you have to do some pretty significant modifications to how you eat, how you live. You know, if you're someone who doesn't enjoy cooking, you definitely want to start dipping and dabbling in the kitchen to kind of start. Maybe you won't ever enjoy cooking, but you definitely want to get to a place where you're able to go into the kitchen and prepare meals for yourself as opposed to buying something convenience in a store or, you know, a food market. You want to keep it simple. You want to start basic and build from there. You definitely want to start thinking about weekly meal planning and meal prepping. And one of the most basic tips that I have as someone who has celiac disease is that you want to start keeping snacks and items in your car or in your bag for the day. You know, I make granola usually, or it's something that's simple that I make often and kind of put in this Ziploc baggie for a snack. And then, there also is a place for those convenience products like some of the, fruit and nut bars. Kind Bars is a great brand. Another great brand, Udi's, makes some really great protein and granola type health bars that are packaged and processed. Many of them that I'm speaking to, Kind Bars, have a higher protein content, have a higher fiber content, and are gluten-free, and they're filling, and they kind of help you never be caught somewhere in a predicament where you don't have something healthy or something safe for you to eat if you do feel like you need to eat. Really being prepared is the biggest tip that I have for someone who is going or adopting a gluten-free diet or a celiac diagnosis or just in general. And visiting my blog, theglutenfreechefblog.com, I have a wealth of reviews on brands, on products that I use every day. Being someone who is a media personality now, and I get samples of many different products from a wide array of different brands and organizations. Anything that you find on my blog, whether it's in a recipe or whether it's something that I've endorsed or reviewed, it's something that I personally have tried and that I use in my day-to-day living. I'm not someone who just kind of like arbitrarily, talks about products that I can't speak to, having a personal connection with them. Another website that I really enjoy is eatsandexercisebyamber.com. Her website, she's a blogger here based in Rochester. She's someone who has celiac disease and a few other health issues. She has a wealth of knowledge on, protein powders to buy, about time protein powder, meal planning and meal prepping, and how to do that in an economical way, how to do that in a budget-friendly way, and how to do that in a simple way so that you can be prepared. And really, when you start talking about meal planning and meal prepping, doing that not only saves you time, but you can save a lot of money by, kind of having some type of a day where you devote to prepping meals or just like the basics for meals. So you might grill like, a pack of chicken for the week, and that way you have it so you can do any number of things to it throughout the week. If you're going to maybe roast veggies, roast a large batch of veggies, things like zucchini, squash, broccoli, etc. are really good to roast in advance, throw in a Tupperware container, and you can then, again, do different things with it. You can add it to a stir fry one day. You can make a soup with it the next day. You can eat it just like with a light balsamic vinaigrette or olive oil on another day. So just kind of thinking about those basic food groups, some kind of a protein, whether it be an animal protein or a non-animal protein, having maybe a starch like a brown rice or a quinoa, and then having your veggies, whether they be fresh veggies like salads, etc., or something that you roast or saute, having a big batch of that, doing that kind of on a one day a week, maybe using a slow cooker. I am a fan of the slow cooker. I have many recipes on the glutenfreechefblog.com that incorporate the use of a slow cooker, kind of slow cooking chicken before you leave in the morning so that when you come back home it's done, it's ready. Those are tips and suggestions that my blog has, and also the website Eats and Exercise by Amber. So, really this is pretty much the conclusion of my presentation. So what I want to do now is kind of go back one by one and revisit some of the summary and reflection questions that we talked about towards the beginning of the webinar. So the first question, is it expensive to eat gluten-free? I hear this a lot, and I think this is definitely a myth about eating gluten-free. I will say, kind of honestly speaking, when you do start to build your gluten-free pantry and you start to purchase flours like rice flour, brown rice flour, they do have a initial sticker shock. For instance, a 1 pound bag of Bob's Red Mill brown rice flour, I believe at Wegmans right now is like $3.49. When you start looking into some of the more expensive flours like coconut flour, almond flour, those per pound at Wegmans, I think it's like maybe $6.99 for like a 1 pound bag of almond flour. So to speak to that, one of the things that I do is I search the website. Amazon.com is a great resource for finding gluten-free products in general for cheaper than you would find them retail. Usually when you start talking about flours, etc., when you're walking into a Wegmans or any grocery store for that matter, you're usually going to pay a higher retail rate than when you go online. Another website to purchase products that are gluten-free more economically or more budget-friendly is VitaCost.com. So it's VITA cost, one word, VitaCost or VitaCost.com. It's a purveyor of healthy, gluten-free, and beyond products. They have a lot of deals like, buy 3, get 1 free, etc. These websites on Amazon.com are great for getting deals on gluten-free flours and products. Also, many of the brands' websites, like EnjoyLifeFoods.com or Kind.com, Udi'sGlutenFree.com, they usually have web-only and sometimes in-store coupons that allow you to have coupons and use them in grocery stores for their products. So that's a great resource and tip as well. But when you kind of take away flours or baking ingredients and you start looking at things like rice, beans, quinoa, kind of pretty much per serving, if you're shopping in a way that's healthier, so let's say I want to go to the grocery store and I want to buy items and ingredients to meal plan gluten-free for the week. Maybe I'll buy, Wegmans family pack of chicken breast. Maybe I'll buy 1 2-pound bag of brown rice flour or brown rice. Maybe I'll buy something like, or you can even buy canned beans. Beans are great to buy canned. Goya brand, black beans, red beans, kidney beans. When you're buying foods like those and thinking more like in bulk, on that level, it's not more expensive to eat gluten-free. And I give people the analogy, think about going into your typical grocery store and going down the cereal aisle. Usually for those boxes of just a normal box of cereal, you're paying somewhere around $4.49 to $4.99 per box of cereal, name brand cereal. You think about like Lay's, potato chips, Doritos, or a pack of Oreo cookies, I think is close to $4 for one pack. So for me, or thinking about that, a pack of gluten-free version Oreo cookies are what, $4.99, whereas the regular version is $3.99. So there's a $1 difference. You really shouldn't be buying, or you probably wouldn't want to buy Oreo cookies regularly. And when you start looking at the name brand processed foods, they really often are not that inexpensive, at least in my opinion. So, is it more expensive to eat gluten-free? Just on a face value level, I would say no. What foods are gluten-free? So we talked a lot about eating whole, clean, real food. And so when you stick to that diet, those ingredients, whole, fresh veggies like, tomatoes, onions, leeks, etc., mushrooms, they're all naturally gluten-free. You really don't start worrying about gluten until you start to get into things that are grain-based. So things that are flour-based, whether you're buying actual bags of flour or you're buying a baked good or some kind of a processed good that has been used or a flour is used to create it, that's where you start to look more into, does it have gluten in it or is it made with wheat flour? Where can I go online to learn more about gluten-free eating? So we've talked about, we've mentioned several websites and resources which we've put in the chat bar here. You can go to the glutenfreechefblog.com, eatsandexercisebyanber.com. You can go to about.com/glutenfree to learn about, gluten-free products, etc. And you can also just kind of Google gluten-free products and a consortium of different gluten-free brands that I use are, will come up. Bob's Red Mill is a great gluten-free purveyor. Udi's Gluten-Free, Glutino.com, EnjoyLifeFoods.com, and many, many others are great resources for those who are looking to eat gluten-free. Here in our local area, Wegmans has a wonderful gluten-free line. Not only their own line is expanding, but also they have a host of other name brands that are gluten-free in most Nature's markets. The one thing about Wegmans is that every store in our area, they have different brands. And so, for instance, the East Avenue store that I frequent that's closest to where I live has a larger array of some of the more unknown or uncommon gluten-free brands than maybe the Lyle Avenue store, or maybe, you know, the Pittsburgh store, the store on Monroe Avenue in Pittsburgh has, you know, one of the largest Nature's markets here in our area. So depending on where you live and what Wegmans is close to you, you might find different gluten-free foods. But again, you're going to find a lot of information online. And then, what are the best gluten-free brands? I've mentioned several: Udi's, Gluten-Free, Kind.com, Enjoy Life Foods, Glutino, and many, many more are great. If you go to the glutenfreechefblog.com and type in, you know, review, you'll find a host of reviews that I've done on products over the years, and you know, most of them are ones that I reviewed very highly and that I recommend and use in my everyday life. So, you know, this is not the end of the discussion, even though this is the end of our webinar. You can keep the conversation going by visiting the glutenfreechefblog.com. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see. We have a question. There you go.
We do, and Dorothea asked, does a person with celiac disease need to avoid flour in the air? If someone near me is flouring chicken, for example, do I need to avoid being around it?
Yeah, I would say yes, just kind of generally speaking, yes. Usually those who have celiac disease, everyone has a different, I guess, threshold and level of sensitivity. I know for some people that I've seen, some children that I've worked with, they might be, you know, in a room where someone is, like you said, flouring chicken, and immediately, within maybe 10 minutes, they're breaking out into hives, you know, et cetera. They start coughing. So depending on a person's sensitivity level, and when you start talking about flour being dusted into the air, it can definitely be an issue, breathing in flour particles. I do know of some anecdotal stories where people, when you get a celiac panel, when they test your blood, it kind of is based on a percentage of antibodies in your blood that they test. And so there have been people that I've read about who they've gone completely gluten-free. They look at, you know, their products are gluten-free that they use, you know, Bath and Body products, and they still have a high antibody count in their blood work in the blood panel. And they found that even some paints or plaster actually have wheat derivatives in them. And so I say that to say, for some people, breathing in dust particles or air that have a high concentration of gluten in them can for sure be an issue. Wegmans just went through this with some of their ventilation in some of their stores. So it definitely can be an issue if you're going to be in an area where you know for sure, maybe for instance, a pizza parlor. That's why many people, even though like, and I'll use the brand name, Mark's Pizzeria, they have a gluten-free option. They usually, on their website and in the store, they say that their facility is not a gluten-dedicated facility, and usually many restaurants that have gluten-free options, they keep those options in a container or a freezer case or fridge case that's separate from everything else, and then those gluten-free items are usually packaged because of airborne gluten particles. So I hope, Dorothy, that answers your question.
We have another question. What have you found to be the most challenging aspect of having celiac disease?
I think the most challenging aspect is, I would say, that initial diagnosis and eating out. You know, I think, you know, food and food events are integral to our society, and most of the things that we celebrate or mourn or just in general have food. And so I would say the most challenging is trying to kind of help your friends and family understand how to prepare for you and not giving them anxiety when they're preparing for you or knowing that you're going to be there. I think that's why I always try to have some type of a snack in my bag, in my car at all times, so that in the event that I am somewhere that there's food and I want to eat something, I always have something that I prepare and have it prepared in advance. And I also, as you start to get more proficient in your existence living gluten-free, you start to know what to ask, call ahead, look on restaurants' websites to kind of help you know what to expect if you're going to eat somewhere. So you do start to get more comfortable over time, for sure.
And then we have one last question. Calvin, what is your favorite gluten-free food?
Well, my favorite cuisine is Thai cuisine because Thai food naturally speaks to gluten-free. When I lived in Nashville for a few years, there was this awesome restaurant called Ginger Thai that, you know, pretty much their whole place was gluten-free because Thai food, when you talk about vermicelli noodles, rice noodles, they, you know, use a lot of fresh veggies and they naturally have many gluten-free options. So Thai food for sure.
Great. Well, thank you very, very much, Calvin. That's all the time we have for Q&A today. Additional questions can be emailed to ritalum@rit.edu or tweeted to @RIT_alumni with the hashtag #MeRITWebinars, and we will direct your questions to Calvin. Note that all participants will receive an email from us in the next few days with a link to today's webinar recording. Many thanks, Calvin, for being our distinguished speaker today, and thank you all to all our listeners for joining us.